Hi guys, welcome to the channel. Nothing is more frustrating than being out all day thinking we've taken some fantastic images only to come home back to the computer and realize there's just something not quite right about the images and the image quality is just not there. So that's why I want to look into image quality today and what steps you can take to ensure that you take images with fantastic quality every time. Let's talk about one of the most important aspects of photography, the light. I'm not so much talking about great light, bad light, what's good light, what's bad light, because I think that's kind of an overrated term. I think what's important to know when it comes to light is what kind of light portrays my subject the best way. A lot of my best images I've taken in pretty poor, pretty dark conditions with high ISO. If you're doing the right editing process, you can turn some images taken in pretty awful conditions into fantastic final images. In my opinion, the only really bad kind of light is too harsh sunlight where the sun is just too high up in the sky. You're getting a lot of heat on the ground, you're getting heat haze, you're getting a lot of unpleasant shadows on your subjects. That's really the only light that I personally consider as bad light. With the sunlight, I feel like the sun is kind of your creative director, which can be great, but at the same time, I really enjoy cloudy conditions because I can really take over the creative control of my images. For instance, I can expose them quite bright and then just darken down the bird, keeping the background a bit lighter, or the colors are quite dull, so I can then saturate the colors I want and leave the colors that I don't want quite dull. So I really enjoy that greater creative process I get when shooting in cloudy conditions. And also just the non-directional light allows me to easily walk around, find the best angle for the bird. So if I'm photographing in a rainforest, I would prefer cloudy conditions because it will give me more even light and I don't have to deal with that mottled, shadowy light with dark spots and bright spots. If I'm photographing ducks on a lake or shorebirds on a beach or birds flying against the sky, I want sunny conditions, simply because we need that blue reflection of the sky in the water so everything looks quite nice. If we don't get that, these images just look dark and dull and grey, and that's really the one time I think you need nice and not too harsh sunlight to get fantastic images. If I'm photographing a bird with a very tricky plumage, like really bright areas, really dark areas, oftentimes cloudy conditions will help me with my exposure. So knowing your subject and knowing what light makes it look the best is one important step forward into getting your image quality to the maximum. There are two more interesting things when it comes to the light. First of all, very low sunlight. I talked about it in my video about sharpness already, that color cast of very strong, very low sunlight can actually make your images look quite strange. Sometimes you just want to clean that up in the editing process to get much crisper, sharper looking images. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to light is heat haze. It's one of the main culprits in ruining people's images. Heat haze is just a change in temperature or water evaporating off the ground, and it's just messing with your images because there's all these like wobbly airwaves between you and the bird. So heat haze is one of those things. There's nothing you can do, and if you see it affecting your images, you unfortunately usually have to pack up and wait for a better day. Let's talk about image quality killer number 2, distance. Nothing ruins your photos more than being too far away from your subject and then cropping in a lot. Almost all the time when people complain to me that the image quality isn't right, the images are not sharp, the colors are not right, they're quite noisy, it's usually because they've photographed a subject very small in the frame and then cropped in really heavily to have it showing big in the frame afterwards. And all that does is really to amplify all the problems that are already existing in your image. So if you crop a lot, you have more noise, your sharpness suffers, and overall the image quality is just not quite there. So what can you do in situations when the subject is just too far away from you? I would usually try to find a way to incorporate the subject in like a larger scene or as part of the landscape. What I would not do is when I'm too far away, slap on a 2x extender or just shoot and crop. I would either try to get closer or deal with what I've been given and try to create a scene where the bird or the subject is part of the whole scene and you can actually create a nice, pleasant image without having to crop too much. Another mistake I see people making, and that heavily affects image quality, is to underexpose your images too much. When I started out in photography, I was always quite scared of blowing any sort of highlight on my image. So I often ended up underexposing 1, 2, 3 stops, ending up with really dark images, but I made sure I maintained like the last little detail in the slightest, brightest feather. That obviously led to very noisy images when I actually had to then increase the brightness on the computer. And even with a camera with the R5, where you can do this a lot more, there is still a big difference between shooting properly exposed or underexposing and then lifting the image. That inevitably just leads to more noise, and we really don't want that in our images. So exposing nice and bright all the way to the right will always yield you better image quality and better results. So watching your exposure, watching your histogram, and making sure there's not a big gap on the right hand side of your histogram will definitely yield you better results and better images. When it comes to the settings, I would make sure that I actually know what I'm doing and that the settings that I'm using make sense for the scene that I'm photographing in. So if you're photographing a bird that's just sitting there, not moving at all, or like a landscape, you will be able to get away with lower ISO, lower shutter speeds, and still maintain a nice and bright histogram and overall good image. But when you're shooting a bird that's hopping around in a dark rainforest, you will need sufficient shutter speed and sufficiently high ISO to freeze that movement at maybe 500th of a second or 640th of a second. I often say getting your exposure right and knowing how the histogram works and what a good histogram should look like is a lot more important than whether you're shooting manual, full manual, manual with auto ISO, aperture priority, or even shutter priority. None of these things really matter, and oftentimes it's best to just use what comes most natural to you. Let's talk about ISO for a little bit, because we all know the lower the noise in the images, the better the image quality. But I've also been saying in a lot of my last videos that you can fairly easily use very high ISO and still end up with good image quality. So how does that go together? Low ISO being the best and me advocating for using higher ISO. I think in the end, ISO is just a tool to get you what you need in the field. So personally, I'm quite happy to push that quite far because there are a lot of programs available now that help me deal with the ISO later on the computer. And if you have a good workflow, like I show you in my masterclass, it's not a problem to deal with noise and the editing of the images afterwards. Where I think it becomes problematic is if you prioritize low ISO and image quality over shutter speed. I think that's a recipe for disaster, and you will likely get into a moment where you miss the shot of a lifetime potentially. In the past, I was very hesitant to shoot above ISO 400, for instance. What happened? I was on a lake one day, I had these Eurasian spoonbills fishing right in front of me. One of them was catching a massive carp, and I had a 3/20th of a second in shutter speed. At the time I thought, oh great, low ISO, I get great shots. Shooting away, I get home to the computer, almost all the shots were just blurry and I just had no good images from a fantastic scene that was happening in front of me. And that really taught me a valuable lesson that a noisy image that's sharp is much better than a blurry image that has low ISO. Now I want to share with you one of my top tips that I've learned over the years, and that is if you use nice bright backgrounds, noise is almost not an issue at all in your images. Shooting with lighter backgrounds is simply much easier and allows me to use higher ISO without the noise showing. Having a light background actually allows me to have faster shutter speed, use higher ISOs, and the noise is actually not showing up because the light background simply doesn't show the noise. If I was shooting the same bird with a dark background, it would be harder to expose the image properly and it would show a lot more noise. So ideally what I try to do is find a background that has a similar brightness, not a similar color, but a complementary color to my bird. And if I find that, I can shoot at high ISO with fast enough shutter speeds and get an almost noise-free image, even at ISO 30 to 100, 60, 400. So even in dark conditions, I try to always find a nice bright patch in my background and use that as my background, because I can have higher shutter speeds and less noise in my images and just get much better images overall. So this is definitely something to remember. The brighter your background, the less noise it will show, and the darker, the more dark green the background is, the more noise will show. For instance, ISO 6400 on a bright background will look less noisy than ISO 1600 on a dark green background. Talking about backgrounds, that's actually one of the elements that can heavily influence your images and also your image quality. Because a great background can perfectly complement your image and create much nicer to looking, more higher image quality. And a bad background can be pretty distracting and just contract from the overall image and make the image appear to have a lower quality. Whether you like it completely blurry or showing some of the habitat in the background or showing a lot of the habitat, it doesn't really matter. What I think is important that you actually consciously think about your background and then make a concerted effort to get the best possible background for your scene. What can also greatly enhance your image quality and overall feel of your images is to create a great sense of intimacy with your images. And how can you do that? For instance, what's really important is eye contact. It's not very intimate if I'm just looking away from the camera, talking at a different camera, but if I'm actually turning and then looking right into the lens and talking to you, now we get a much closer, much more intimate feel, and you feel like I'm just talking directly to you. Whereas if I'm looking at the other camera far away, or might even look that way and I'm small in the frame, it's not a very pleasant, intimate image. So we want that direct eye contact, and the closer, the better quite often, to create that really intimate feel with your subject. Eye contact is the first part. The other part is also try and be level with your subject. You don't really want to be shooting up or really down. You want to create the feel that you're on the same level with your subject. So having that eye contact and being level with the bird goes a great length towards giving you good image quality and a really good overall feel in your images. Another very important aspect of image quality is sharpness. I made a whole video about sharpness, so you can check that out. I talk about sharpness in great detail and how can you achieve sharpness and a lot of steps that will help you to take sharper images. So I don't want to go into too great detail today, but there's a few important factors that I want to mention. The first one I already mentioned: use high enough ISO so you have fast enough shutter speeds. That's really the key of everything. If your shutter speed is too low, you will just end up with blurry images, and that's no good, is it? There are two things that you can do instantly to improve image quality and sharpness, and the first one is dump your UV filter. I know camera stores love to give it to you as a little upsell for like an extra $50 or $100, but these filters generally have worse image quality and give you less sharp images. So why use them? I know some people say if you drop your lens right on the filter, maybe only the filter breaks, but is it really worth it to save your lens that you might never drop, but in return get bad images the whole time you're using the lens? Well, at least for me, it's not. And after my video about sharpness, there was a lot of people in the comments that took their UV filters off and instantly got better and sharper images. So I think it's really something to think about. And secondly, what also helps your image quality is to stop down and not shoot wide open all the time. A lot of lenses, especially cheaper zoom lenses, for instance like a Tamron 150 to 600 millimeter lens that's wide open at 6.3, will be significantly sharper at like f8 or f9 when stopped down a little bit. So I think that's really important that you stop down with these lenses. And also when you're using extenders, it's definitely beneficial to stop down one stop. For instance, if you have an f4 lens with a 1.4 extender that's wide open at f5.6, stopping down to f8 will increase sharpness and will give you better overall images. When we talk about sharpness, we may as well also quickly talk about depth of field, because that's another important factor that can at least influence the perceived image quality of your image. If you have an image with very shallow depth of field, it might actually not look like the image quality is there because only a small part of the bird might be in focus. For instance, the belly and the feet and part of the neck might already not be in focus if the bird's quite close to you and you're shooting wide open. So while you can shoot wide open as a creative tool, I would always try to make sure that if I'm shooting a bird on a nice perch, for instance, to have as much of the bird and the perch in focus, simply because the image will appear sharper and the overall image quality will usually be better. Let's talk about image editing, because in the digital workflow it has become such an important part in getting the best final images. Great raw files and great field technique are one important factor, but you also need to know what you're doing when it comes to editing your raw files on the computer. These days, it's actually quite easy to transform a dull and noisy image into a great looking final image. For instance, this Mallee ringneck behind me, we took it on a dark, dull day after sunset, ISO 12,800, so the raw file was pretty dull, pretty dark, but I ran it to DxO Pure Raw, used one of my Pro sets, edited just like I show you in my masterclass, and actually was able to transform the raw file into a really good looking final image that seems to have much better image quality than the original raw file. So if you want to learn all about my Pro sets and how to get a great starting point in your raw processing, and also learn my Photoshop workflow where I show you step by step how to master image editing, make sure to check out my links down there in the description. Part of the things that I always talk about when I teach people Photoshop is that you don't just want to learn how to process your raw files as you would do in Lightroom, but you also want to learn how to do certain things in Photoshop, like removing distracting elements that can really help you improve your images, fix some imperfections in the bird's plumage, for instance, and especially remove unwanted color casts from your images, because that can give you much better, much nicer overall feel. And personally, I also find it important that I add enough nice saturation, brightness, and contrast to my images so they really stand out. But even if you like a very neutral, natural look in your images, it's still important that you know how to edit your images and that you get to where you want to be. Another important factor when it comes to image quality is the gear you're using. Typically, when it comes to cameras, more expensive cameras and more expensive lenses will also give you better overall image quality, smoother looking backgrounds, less noise, and better overall sharpness. I know in one of my last videos you weren't happy that I mentioned gear right at the beginning, so I left it right towards the end this time, and I think you can take fantastic images with all sorts of gear, but generally speaking, the more expensive, more higher end gear will also yield you better overall image quality and sharpness. So that's just something to keep in mind, and I'm not saying it to brag about expensive gear or tell you should buy more expensive gear. No, not at all. But I think what's important when it comes to gear is to realize what sort of gear you're using and to keep your expectations in check. Because for instance, this big 600mm lens behind me will take much better, much sharper images than even this fairly expensive 100 to 500mm lens. And if you compare it to cheaper like 75 to 300mm zoom lens, the difference will be night and day between those two lenses. So when it comes to image quality and sharpness, it's important that you also realize I'm using this in this kind of gear. So this is probably the most I will actually be able to achieve, and not be disappointed or not start comparing it to big 600mm prime lens that cost $20,000, because you just can't compare the two. If you follow all the steps that I tried to teach you in this video today, you will be able to take great images with great image quality with any kind of gear. And lastly, I want to talk about something that's not just true for bird photography or image quality, but photography in general, and that's you have to know your subject so you can be at the right place at the right time. For instance, with this Regent parrot in the background there, I had to know where the birds are, what their behavior is, set up in the right spot, and then wait to get this image. The same is true for landscape images, for instance. There might only be a certain day of the year where the sun rises in a perfect spot to get that perfect looking image. So you'll have to do some research, find out when that day is, and then be there to get that shot. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that it will allow you to take your image quality to the next level. Let me know in the comments, what were the main obstacles that you've been facing when it comes to achieving great image quality? Also make sure to check out my brand new pro sets and masterclass down there in the description, because I know they will help your editing process tremendously. Other than that, please make sure to subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up, and I will see you guys in one of my next videos. Bye!